Hell's Angels kidnapped a World War II veteran from a nursing home. They will regret it. The rain hammered against the windows of Mercy General Nursing Home as Sarah Martinez finished her night shift rounds. It was 11:47 p.m. when she noticed something that made her blood run cold. Room 312 was empty. The bed where 96-year-old Lieutenant Colonel Frank "Tank" Stevens should have been sleeping was stripped bare, and his wheelchair was gone. Sarah's hands trembled as she checked the logbook. No discharge orders. No family pickup. No medical transport. Frank Stevens, the most decorated World War II veteran in the facility, had simply vanished into the stormy night. What Sarah didn't know was that 3 hours earlier, 12 members of the Hells Angels Motorcycle Club had rolled up to the nursing home's service entrance on their Harley-Davidsons, engines rumbling like thunder in the darkness. The security cameras mysteriously malfunctioned at exactly 8:30 p.m. By 8:45 p.m., they had Frank Stevens in a van, speeding toward their compound on the outskirts town. The leader of this operation was Marcus Reaper Johnson, a 45-year-old ex-Marine with arms covered in tattoos and a reputation that made even hardened criminals cross the street. What the nursing home staff, the police, and even Frank's own family didn't understand was why the most feared motorcycle club in 3 states had just committed what appeared to be a federal kidnapping. The answer lay buried in the jungles of Vietnam 53 years ago. Chapter 1, The Confession. Detective Ray Morrison had seen plenty of strange cases in his 20-year career, but this one defied logic. He stared at the security footage from a nursing home's parking lot, watching 12 leather-clad figures move with military precision through the rain. They knew exactly what they were doing. Morrison muttered to his partner, Detective Lisa Chun. Look at this coordination. 1 man disables the cameras. 2 create a diversion at the front desk, and the rest extract the target through the service entrance. This wasn't random. Chun nodded grimly. Frank Stevens wasn't just any resident. Distinguished Service Cross, Purple Heart, Bronze Star with Valor Device. The man was a legend. Morrison raised an eyebrow. Figure speech. But at 96, if they're planning to harm him, Chen's voice trailed off. That's when Morrison's phone rang. The caller ID showed unknown, but the voice on the other end was unmistakably authoritative. Detective Morrison? This is Marcus Johnson. You're looking for Frank Stevens. Morrison's blood pressure spiked. Marcus Reaper? Johnson was calling him directly. Johnson, if you've hurt that old man, meet me at Denny's on Highway 42 in 1 hour. Come alone. No wires, no backup. Frank has something he needs to tell you before he dies. The line went dead. Against every protocol in the book, Morrison drove to the meeting alone. The Denny's parking lot was nearly empty, except for a single Harley-Davidson and a massive figure in leather sitting by the window. Marcus Johnson looked exactly like his mugshots, but older, more weathered. Prison tattoos covered his neck, and his eyes held the hollow stare of someone who had seen too much violence. But when Morrison sat down across from him, he noticed something unexpected. Tears. You think we kidnapped him? Johnson said without preamble. Didn't you? Johnson laughed bitterly. Frank asked us to take him. Begged us, actually. Said he had something to confess before cancer killed him, and he couldn't trust anyone else. Morrison leaned forward. What kind of confession? The kind that could destroy a lot of powerful people. The kind that explains why Frank Stevens, war hero, has been living in a nursing home for 3 years while his family fights over his will. Johnson pulled out a weathered photograph and slid it across the table. It showed a young soldier in jungle fatigues standing next to a Huey helicopter. The soldier had Johnson's eyes, but the face was decades younger. My father, Johnson said quietly. Sergeant Tommy Johnson, 1st Cavalry Division, killed in action near Da Nang, March 15, 1971. At least, that's what the Army told my mother. Morrison studied the photograph. What does this have to do with Frank Stevens? Frank was his commanding officer. And Frank just told me that my father didn't die in combat. Johnson's voice dropped to a whisper. He was murdered by his own squad for refusing to participate in a massacre. The detective felt the world shift beneath him. That's a serious accusation. It gets worse. The massacre was covered up by Frank's superiors, and my father was framed as a traitor to keep him quiet. Frank has carried this secret for 53 years, and now he wants to set the record straight before he dies. Johnson stood up, his massive frame casting a shadow over the table. Come with me, detective. Frank has documents, photographs, and testimony that will expose one of the biggest cover-ups in military history. But he's only got days to live, and there are people who will kill to keep this buried. Chapter 2, The Compound. The Hells Angels compound sat on 40 acres of heavily wooded land, surrounded by razor wire and no trespassing signs. Morrison followed Johnson's motorcycle through the front gate, pass guard post manned by club members who looked like they could break him in half without breaking a sweat. The main building was a converted warehouse with dozens of motorcycles parked out front. But instead of the drug lab or weapons cache Morrison expected, he found something completely different. A makeshift medical facility. Frank Stevens lay in a hospital bed surrounded by oxygen tanks and 4 drips. Despite his age and condition, his eyes were sharp and alert. He was still wearing his Purple Heart on his hospital gown. Detective Morrison, Frank said in a voice barely above a whisper, "Thank you for coming. I don't have much time." A woman in scrubs approached with a syringe. Morrison tensed, but Johnson held up a hand. "Relax. That's Dr. Amanda Walsh. She's been treating Frank pro bono since the nursing home started making mistakes with his medication." Dr. Walsh, a woman in her 50s with kind eyes and steady hands, administered the injection with practiced efficiency. "Pain medication," she explained to Morrison. "Frank's cancer has metastasized. He has maybe a week left." Frank beckoned Morrison closer. "Detective, what do you know about Operation Fallen Angel?" Morrison shook his head. "Never heard of it." "That's because it was classified above top secret and buried deeper than Jimmy Hoffa. March 1971. I was a lieutenant colonel with the 1st Cavalry Division. My unit was tasked with clearing suspected Viet Cong villages near the DMZ. Frank paused, struggling to breathe. Dr. Walsh checked his vitals and nodded for him to continue. "We had intelligence that a village called Foolin was harboring enemy combatants. But when we arrived, all we found were old men, women, and children. My commanding officer, Colonel Richard Blackwood, ordered us to eliminate everyone anyway." Morrison felt his stomach turn. "A massacre?" "I refused the order. So did Sergeant Tommy Johnson and 3 other men in my unit. We were prepared to face court-martial rather than murder innocent civilians." Frank's voice grew stronger with determination. But Colonel Blackwood had other plans. He had Tommy and the other dissenters transferred to a high-risk patrol. The next day, their helicopter went down in enemy territory. All 5 men listed as killed in action. Johnson stepped forward, his massive hands clenched into fists. "But they weren't killed by the enemy, were they?" Frank shook his head slowly. "The helicopter was shot down by our own forces. Blackwood couldn't risk them talking about what happened at Fuin, so he had them eliminated and covered it up as combat casualties." Morrison scribbled notes frantically. "Do you have proof of this?" Frank gestured to a metal lockbox beside his bed. Photographs, radio transcripts, after-action reports, and sworn statements from the helicopter crew who were ordered to participate in the cover-up. Everything you need to expose the truth. "Why now?" Morrison asked. "Why wait 50 years to come forward?" Frank's eyes filled with tears. "Because I was a coward. Blackwood promoted me and transferred me to a cushy desk job in Saigon. Said if I kept my mouth shut, I'd go home with commendations and a bright future. If I talked, I'd disappear just like Tommy and the others." Dr. Walsh checked Frank's pulse and frowned. "His blood pressure is spiking. He needs to rest." But Frank gripped Morrison's arm with surprising strength. "There's more. Colonel Blackwood didn't just cover up one massacre. Operation Fallen Angel was a systematic program to eliminate witnesses to multiple war crimes. Over 300 American soldiers were murdered by their own command to protect high-ranking officers. Morrison's pen stopped moving. 300. Blackwood went on to become a 4-star general. He's currently serving as chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. General Richard Blackwood, the most powerful military officer in America, built his career on the bodies of the soldiers he murdered. The room fell silent, except for the hum of medical equipment. Morrison stared at the lockbox, realizing he was looking at evidence that could topple the highest levels of the Pentagon. Why give this to me? Morrison asked. Why not the FBI, the media, Congress? Johnson answered grimly. Because they've already tried to silence Frank twice. The accidents at the nursing home weren't accidents. Someone's been slowly poisoning him, and when that didn't work fast enough, they arranged for a medical emergency that would have killed him yesterday. Dr. Walsh nodded confirmation. I ran toxicology tests on Frank's blood. Someone's been administering small doses of digoxin, causing his heart to fail gradually. It would have looked like natural causes. Morrison felt the pieces clicking together. That's why you took him from the nursing home. Frank called Marcus 3 days ago, Dr. Walsh explained. Said he knew he was being murdered and needed protection long enough to get his testimony on record. The Hell's Angels might look like criminals to you, detective, but they're the only ones who care more about protecting a veteran than they do about their own freedom. Frank struggled to sit up. Detective, I need you to promise me something. When I die, this evidence goes public. No matter who tries to stop you, no matter what threats you receive, the families of those murdered soldiers deserve the truth. Morrison looked around the room at the hardened criminals who had risked everything to protect one dying veteran's final mission. He thought about Tommy Johnson and 299 other soldiers whose families still believed their sons had died as heroes, not knowing they were actually victims of the system they'd sworn to protect. I promise, Morrison said. Chapter 3. The Hunt. General Richard Blackwood sat in his Pentagon office, staring at intelligence reports that made his blood run cold. Frank Stevens had disappeared from Mercy General Nursing Home, and the Hells Angels Motorcycle Club was suspected of involvement. At 73, Blackwood had survived 5 decades in the military by eliminating threats before they could destroy him. Frank Stevens represented the biggest threat of his career. Sir, his aide, Colonel Janet Reeves, stood in the doorway. The FBI has located Stevens. He's at a motorcycle compound outside the city. Blackwood's jaw tightened. Asset status? Declining rapidly. Medical surveillance indicates he has less than a week to live. Too long. Blackwood reached for his secure phone. Activate Containment Protocol 7. Full authorization. Within 2 hours, a joint task force of FBI agents, DEA officers, and military police surrounded the Hells Angels compound. The official story was a raid on suspected drug trafficking. The real mission was to eliminate Frank Stevens and anyone who had heard his testimony. Detective Morrison was still at the compound when the first helicopters appeared on the horizon. We've got company, Johnson announced, watching the aircraft through binoculars. Federal task force, full tactical gear. This isn't about drugs. Morrison felt his phone buzzing. A text message from an unknown number. Leave now or die with them. Dr. Walsh was monitoring Frank's condition when the power suddenly cut out. Emergency generators kicked in, but she knew they only had a few hours of backup power from medical equipment keeping Frank alive. They're trying to kill him by cutting life support, she said grimly. Johnson gathered his club members in the main room. 12 hardened bikers, most of them military veterans, faced the possibility of a fight they couldn't win. Brothers, Johnson said quietly, we all knew this day might come. Frank Stevens saved my father's honor, and I'll die before I let them silence him again. One by one, each member nodded agreement. They had lived by a code that put loyalty above personal safety, and that code wouldn't break now. Morrison stood up. There's another way. I can call my supervisor, get the media involved, make this public before they can cover it up. Your phone's jammed, Johnson said, checking his own device. They're using military-grade signal blockers. No communication, in or out. Through the windows, they could see tactical teams surrounding the building. Snipers took positions on nearby hills. Armored vehicles blocked every exit. Frank struggled to speak. Don't let them win. Dr. Walsh increased his pain medication. He's going into cardiac arrest. Without proper equipment, I can't. Do whatever you can, Morrison said. Keep him alive long enough to get his testimony recorded. Johnson pulled out an old digital camera. Frank, we're going to record everything you remember about Operation Fallen Angel. Names, dates, locations, everything. For the next 6 hours, as federal agents prepared their final assault, Frank Stevens recounted 50 years of buried secrets. He named names, described atrocities, and provided details that could only come from someone who had been there. Meanwhile, Dr. Walsh worked medical miracles to keep him conscious and coherent. The Hells Angels took turns standing guard, knowing that each hour they bought might be their last. Chapter 4, The Last Stand. At dawn, the assault began. Federal agents stormed the compound from 3 directions, using flashbang grenades and smoke canisters to disorient the defenders. But the Hells Angels had prepared well, using their knowledge of the building's layout to maximum advantage. Morrison found himself crouched behind an overturned table, wondering how his career had led him to a firefight with federal agents. The irony wasn't lost on him. He was breaking the law to expose the biggest law enforcement cover-up in history. Johnson fought with the tactical precision of his Marine training, using motorcycle parts as improvised weapons and cover. His club members followed his lead, turning their garage into a fortress. But they were vastly outnumbered and outgunned. The real miracle was that they held out as long as they did. In the medical room, Dr. Walsh continued treating Frank while bullets shattered windows around them. The old veteran remained conscious through sheer willpower, determined to finish his testimony. The helicopter pilot's name was Captain James Morrison. Frank whispered to camera, "Your father, detective." He was ordered to shoot down Tommy Johnson's transport, but he refused and was transferred out of Vietnam the next week. Morrison nearly dropped the camera. "My father was involved in this?" "Your father was a hero," Frank said firmly. He saved copies of the flight logs and radio communications. Check his effects. Look for a safety deposit box under the name Operation Truth. The federal assault intensified. Tear gas canisters crashed through windows. The sound of automatic weapons filled the air. Johnson appeared beside Morrison, blood streaming from a head wound. "They're breaching the north wall. We've got maybe 10 minutes before they reach this room." Dr. Walsh checked Frank's vitals one final time. "His heart is failing. The stress is too much." Frank grabbed Morrison's hand with his last burst of strength. "The lockbox, take it. Tell the families they were heroes." Lieutenant Colonel Frank Tank Stevens, Distinguished Service Cross recipient and keeper of the military's darkest secret, died at 6:47 a.m. with a smile on his face. He had finally completed his mission. Chapter 5, The Reckoning. The federal assault team burst into medical room to find Detective Morrison performing CPR on an already dead patient, while Dr. Walsh sobbed over her equipment. The Hells Angels had surrendered when it became clear that continued resistance would only result in more casualties. Agent Sarah Patterson, the FBI task force leader, stared at the scene with confusion. She had expected a drug lab or weapons cache, not a makeshift hospital room where bikers had been protecting a dying veteran. "What the hell is going on here?" Patterson demanded. Morrison looked up from Frank's body. "These men are heroes. They risked everything to protect a witness to war crimes." "What witness?" "This is a drug raid." Morrison stood up slowly, still holding the lockbox of evidence. "Agent Patterson, I'm placing you under citizen's arrest for conspiracy to commit murder." Patterson laughed. "You're insane." The man you just killed was trying to expose General Richard Blackwood for murdering 300 American soldiers in Vietnam. This entire raid was ordered to silence him. Patterson's smile faded. You're talking about treason, detective. Yes, I am. And I have 6 hours of recorded testimony to prove it. That's when Johnson, bleeding and handcuffed, spoke up from the corner. Detective, check your email. Morrison frowned. My phone's been jammed all night. Dr. Walsh set up a dead man switch on the compound's internet connection. Every time Frank spoke, his testimony was automatically uploaded to secure servers and sent to media contacts worldwide. Dr. Walsh managed a weak smile through her tears. I may be a small-town doctor, but my brother runs a tech company. Frank's entire confession has been copied to servers in 12 countries. Patterson's radio crackled to life. Command, we have a problem. Multiple news outlets are reporting a story about military war crimes and cover-ups. They're citing recorded testimony from someone named Frank Stevens. Within hours, the story exploded across every major news network. The hashtag Operation Fallen Angel trended worldwide. Military families who had lost sons in Vietnam demanded answers. Congressional leaders called for immediate investigations. General Blackwood was arrested at his Pentagon office, charged with conspiracy, murder, and treason. The evidence Frank had preserved for 50 years proved overwhelming. Chapter 6, Justice Delayed. The trials took 3 years to complete. General Blackwood was convicted on 312 counts of murder and sentenced to life in prison without parole. 14 other high-ranking military officers faced similar charges. Detective Morrison was temporarily suspended for his role in the compound standoff, but ultimately vindicated when the full scope of the cover-up became public. He was promoted to captain and assigned to a new cold case unit specializing in military crimes. Dr. Amanda Walsh received the Presidential Medal of Freedom for her medical care veterans and her role in exposing Operation Fallen Angel. She used the award money to establish a free clinic for homeless veterans. The Hells Angels faced federal charges for kidnapping, but public opinion had shifted dramatically. Marcus Reaper Johnson and his club members became unlikely heroes, profiled in magazines and invited to speak at veterans' events. During their trial, the prosecutors struggled to explain to a jury why 12 bikers should be punished for protecting a dying veteran who wanted to expose the truth about murdered soldiers. The jury deliberated for only 30 minutes before returning not guilty verdicts on all major charges. The bikers were sentenced to time served on minor weapons violations and released a thunderous applause from the gallery. Johnson used his newfound fame to establish the Tommy Johnson Foundation, providing legal assistance to military families seeking answers about suspicious combat deaths. Chapter 7, The Truth Commission. President Harrison established a Truth and Reconciliation Commission to investigate military cover-ups spanning 6 decades. The commission's findings were shocking. Operation Fallen Angel was just one of 17 classified programs designed to eliminate witnesses to military crimes. Over 2,000 American service members had been murdered by their own command structure to protect senior officers from prosecution. The commission identified patterns of abuse dating back to Korea and extending through Iraq and Afghanistan. Whistleblowers were systematically eliminated through staged accidents, friendly fire incidents, and medical murders. Captain Morrison was appointed to lead the commission's investigative team. His first stop was a safety deposit box in downtown Washington, registered under the name Operation Truth by his father, Captain James Morrison, in 1971. Inside, he found flight logs, radio transcripts, and photographs documenting the murder of Sergeant Tommy Johnson and his squad. His father had carried the secret for 50 years, unable to speak out for fear of retaliation against his family. Captain Morrison's final report documented the systematic murder of American heroes by the very institution they had sworn to serve. The report's conclusion was simple. We failed our warriors. We must do better. Epilogue, the memorial. 5 years after Frank Stevens' death, the Tommy Johnson Memorial was dedicated at Arlington National Cemetery. The black granite wall bore the names of 2,347 American service members who had been murdered by their own command. Marcus Johnson, now in his 50s and president of the largest veterans advocacy group in America, gave the dedication speech. Behind him stood 11 other former Hell's Angels, now respected community leaders and veterans advocates. These names represent more than statistics, Johnson said, his voice carrying across the crowd of thousands. They represent sons and daughters, brothers and sisters, mothers and fathers who died not for their country, but because they chose conscience over convenience. Dr. Walsh, now running a network of veterans clinics nationwide, laid a wreath at the Memorial Center. The inscription read, "To those who died for truth and those who live to tell it." Captain Morrison, recently promoted to major and assigned to the Pentagon's new Military Justice Reform Division, stood with the families of the murdered soldiers. Many of them had spent decades believing their loved ones died as cowards or traitors, only to discover they had been heroes who refused to participate in atrocities. As the ceremony concluded, an elderly woman approached Johnson. She wore a Gold Star mother pin and carried a faded photograph of a young soldier in jungle fatigues. "Mr. Johnson," she said quietly, "my son was Sergeant Tommy Johnson. I've waited 50 years to thank the man who cleared his name." Johnson knelt before the woman who had given birth to the father he never knew. "Ma'am, your son was a hero. He died protecting innocent people, and his sacrifice saved thousands of lives through reforms his death helped create." The woman pressed the photograph into Johnson's hands. This was taken the day before he died. He wrote on the back that he was proud to serve with men like Lieutenant Colonel Stevens, who taught him that some things are worth dying for. Johnson turned the photograph over. In faded ink, his father had written, "Mom, if something happens to me, know that I died doing what was right. Some orders should never be obeyed. Love, Tommy." As the sun set over Arlington Cemetery, Johnson realized that his father's legacy lived on through the bikers who had chosen justice over safety, the doctor who had chosen healing over hiding, and a detective who had chosen truth over career advancement. The Hells Angels had kidnapped a World War II veteran from a nursing home, and the people responsible for trying to silence him had indeed regretted it. Sometimes justice takes 50 years to arrive. Sometimes it comes riding motorcycles and wearing leather jackets. And sometimes the most dangerous criminals are the ones wearing uniforms and medals. Frank Stevens had kept his promise to expose the truth. The families of 2,347 murdered soldiers finally had their answers. And somewhere in the great beyond, Sergeant Tommy Johnson could finally rest in peace, knowing that his son had grown up to be exactly the kind of man he had died protecting. The memorial's final inscription captured the lesson of Operation Fallen Angel. Democracy dies in darkness, but truth has a way of finding the light.